put a PowerPoint together for tonight, and it was doing fine at home. Then I got here, and the thing is corrupted. So all that hard work for nothing. But that wouldn't be the first time that's happened to me, so oh well. It's one of those weeks, huh, Matt? Where's Matt at? Oh, there he is over there, yeah. All right, so let's see what I can remember from memory on the plagues and the various gods that I had mentioned on those. Before we jump into that, we want to have a prayer. We are going to be on lesson 4. I want to finish up lesson 4. We're going to do lesson 4 tonight. I do want to finish up lesson 3. We stopped off on question 12 on lesson 3, so I do want to say some things about that. So we're going to be on Exodus. You might want to go ahead and turn your Bible to chapter 8. I will need some help, if you don't mind, tonight from some folks who might want to volunteer to help read a little bit. I would appreciate that. My allergies have been bothering me pretty bad. It's going to be a rough spring because my throat is not feeling the best. And it's just the spring does not treat me well here in Tennessee. But at least I'm not getting shots in my backside like I did the first 2 years I was here. That's how it was for me. So it's the spring doesn't treat me too well here in Tennessee. Brother Wayne, would you mind please giving us a prayer, please? Amen. Thank you, Wayne. Okay, so we've started the plagues, so let's kind of continue to go through that. God is going to perform his wonders in Egypt, and so far we've considered 2 of the plagues. What was the first one? Say it again. I'm sorry, somebody. What did you say? Right, and which body of water are we talking about? The Nile. And why is that important again, somebody? Why is the Nile so important? Yeah, that's where there's their survival right there. So we looked at the Nile turn to blood. And what we're really trying to consider here is what is really being exposed. We'll talk more about that on a question here in the next lesson. But remember, the Egyptians had many gods that they worshipped, many quote-unquote deities, and they had a god for essentially every aspect of life. The Nile itself was considered to be a deity, but when God turned their main water source into blood, this exposed Cunum, who was supposed to be the protector of the Nile, because remember, everything died in the Nile. It smelled bad. It was undrinkable. So you have Happy, Cunum, Osiris. They're being exposed through this plague. They could not stop the Nile from turning into blood. The second plague was the frogs. Remember, God sent frogs, probably thousands and thousands of frogs throughout Egypt. And they went into everyone's bed, everyone's cooking supplies, even went into Pharaoh's bed. And this was important because the goddess Heket was represented by a frog. The frog was actually viewed as a sacred animal among the Egyptians. This animal went on from being sacred to where they would to stop. Pharaoh would beg God to stop this. And when the frog ceased, well, then he would go right back to his bad ways. Okay, so let's kind of go where we stopped off. And what's the next one? Someone tell me, what's the next plague? Yes. Probably the more accurate translation would be lice. something so small, maybe a gnat even, so small you can't even really, it's hard to see with the visible eye. But let's go ahead and read that. Would somebody mind reading Exodus chapter 8, 16 through 19? Who could read that? Brother Al, could you do that, please? Thank you. Thank you, Al. So let's talk about this. What stands out to you about this plague, anybody? What stood out to you about this one that made it maybe even a little bit more interesting than the other two we've looked at so far? Yeah, you got man and beast. Man and beast are definitely impacted by this negatively. That's a good observation. Yeah, the magicians, they couldn't duplicate this one. In fact, going to question 13, how did they respond? Not only could they not duplicate it, but they said something. What did they acknowledge? They said God is doing it. They said God, the finger of God. I like my translation says, this is the finger of God. They acknowledge the one true God. And they acknowledged that to Pharaoh, that this is not a trick here. We can't do this one. And notice, so they're out of the game early. I mean, they by plague 3, they can't even duplicate it in any way at all. Where did the lice come from? Came from the dust. So they came from the dust of the earth. This was an insignificant one because this would expose an Egyptian god by the name of Geb. Geb was known to be the god, quote unquote, of the earth. He was the god that allowed crops to grow, they believed. He was the god that controlled earthquakes. And notice, from the earth is where the lice came. So Geb was rendered powerless, right? Because he could not stop this. So this plague, how did Pharaoh respond to this, though? How did he respond to even what the magician said, that this is the hand of God? What do y'all have on that one? His heart is hardened. So what does that tell you about Pharaoh? What kind of man? How would you describe this man so far, Pharaoh? Yeah, he's a selfish man. Somebody else? Stubborn. He's a stubborn man. My way or the highway. Yeah, he's a man who has a lot of pride. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So go to the next lesson now. Let's go to lesson 4. Let's just pop through these next plagues real quick because I really want to spend our time answering the questions on page 16. Now, I did have a whole set of slides for this, and they're all gone. I mean, it's devastating to me when you consider how long I worked on them. But if you don't, just be patient with me. I want to kind of go through this. I won't be able to remember all the gods because I had them all down, but I'm sorry about that. Okay, so y'all help me with this. The 4th plague, let's go through real quick. That is what? The flies. And we're starting there. We're looking at 20 in Exodus 8, 20 and 20, 22. Can anybody read Exodus 8, 20 through 22? Would anybody mind reading that? Joe, you had your hand up. Go ahead, sir, if you don't mind. Exodus 8, 20 through 22. What translation is that, Joe? That's New American. Yours says swarms of insects. Interesting. Yours must be a different year than mine. Mine is New American Standard. Mine says swarms of flies. I think yours is more accurate. I think swarms of flies may not be the most accurate translation. I think swarms of insects may be more close to what we're looking at. Some scholars say that this may have been a reference to a beetle of some kind, the scarab beetle. And the reason some scholars come to this conclusion is because the chief god among the Egyptians was the god called Amun-Ra. And Amun-Ra was typically portrayed in the Egyptian artwork that's having the head of a beetle. So their chief god sometimes has the head of a beetle. The scarab beetle is said, if this was a scarab beetle, this type of creature, some say that this beetle could have caused more damage than termites. Anybody ever had termites before? They're not too kind, are they? You don't want termites. Well, imagine something worse than termites. And that may be what's under consideration here. So you may have a beetle of some kind or some other insect of some kind that is doing this. Regardless, this thing does a lot of damage, right? A lot of damage being done. Look at the next one. Question 2, the fifth plague is what? What's the fifth plague? The livestock. And when we say livestock, what's all under consideration here from the text? You have diseased livestock. So they're getting sick and they're dying and they have disease. We're talking about cows. We're talking about horses. We're talking about donkeys. We're talking about camels. We're talking about all the land animals are being impacted here. Maybe not all. We'll talk about distinguish. God is doing a distinguishing thing here. But among those who are rejecting him, they're having some problems with their livestock. So you have diseased livestock. Okay, what's the next one? Plague 6. What's the next one? Before that one even, there was one more. Look at verse boils. So what are boils? Yeah, just nasty sores. Remember, I think Job, did he break out with boils? You have the magicians, they broke out with boils. They couldn't stand before Pharaoh. You have boils on man, and you have even on the beast. All the beasts of the land of Egypt, they're getting boils. Okay, what's the seventh plague? You said it, Debbie. What's the next one? The hail. That's Exodus chapter 9, beginning with verse 18. God has the hail come. The hail comes, and what does the hail do? The storms that's coming. And this is important because this is the first plague that's going to come from the sky. This originates from the sky. And what does it do? It destroys a lot. It destroys a whole lot. So you got, and let me just say this before I move any further, there were some Egyptians who would listen to the warning of God, right? Because those who listen to God, what did they do? What did God want them to do with their animals and servants? Bring them in. And some did that. Some did that. So you got some people listening, fearing God at this point. But those who didn't fear God, left their servants out there, left their beasts out there, it was killed by the hail. Now, whatever the hail didn't get, what came next? The locusts came. Who ate locusts in the Bible? Yeah, John the Baptist. That has nothing to do with anything. I just wanted to say that. Yeah, it's kind of weird. But you got the locusts come, and the locusts destroy whatever the hail doesn't destroy. And they come through there in a huge swarm and eat up everything. So you have it being devastated by hail. You have being devastated by locusts. And let me just say, again, don't forget the Egyptian gods here that are being called out. It's important to understand that there were gods. The Egyptians had gods over the land animals. They had some of their gods represented by the head of a bull. Apis was an Egyptian god that had the head of a bull. You had some gods that had the head of a cow. You had some gods that had the head of a cat. All these land animals, and yet God is bringing devastation to them. You also had gods over medicine. You had gods over healing. They had gods they were over medicine and things like that, and none of those gods came to their aid when they had the boils. You had gods that were said to be the gods of the sky. One of the Egyptian gods that was said to be the god of the sky was a god called Nut, N-U-T. And yet he couldn't stop the hail from coming, right? And then you had some gods who were god of insects, and they were also gods that were supposed to protect the crops, where they were supposed to keep the crops from dying. But what happened when the locusts came? Where were those gods then? They didn't help the Egyptians, did they? So all these gods that they had, they said they bowed down to and served and were supposed to protect them, God is exposing them, right? So after the locusts, we get to plague 9, and what's that one? Darkness. How bad was the darkness? Can you imagine that? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I don't like darkness really anyway. But can you imagine darkness so intense that you can feel it? That's pretty dark, isn't it? The darkness is so intense that you can feel it. And how long does the darkness last? 3 days. 3 days, except there was light in Goshen. The Israelites had light. The Egyptians didn't have light. And this is important because, remember, the chief god, said to be the chief god of the Egyptians, was Amun-Ra. And Amun-Ra, when you look at his picture, if you Google it, you'll have above his head a solar disk. And he was said to be the god of the sun. He was the god of light. And yet their chief god, their main god, he couldn't keep the darkness away for 3 days, could he? The sun didn't shine in Egypt. And then we come to the 10th plague, which I personally believe has to be the most devastating of the plagues, which was what? Death of the firstborn. Man and beast, the firstborns throughout the land died, except among God's people, those who obeyed his instructions in regards to how to keep their firstborns from dying. But Pharaoh's firstborn, everyone's firstborn, slave, rich people, throughout the land, they all died. And this was a shot at a god that was said to be the god of death. I can't recall the name of that god. I had it on my slide. But they also had a god of the underworld. They had a god of death. They had gods that were supposed to protect the children. And yet none of those gods came to the aid of the Egyptians on that night. God exposed them, didn't he? So, yes, ma'am. Go right ahead. Yes, ma'am. That's how yours, what verse is that? I'm sorry. What verse is that? I'm sorry. Let me, I see that. Of chapter, what chapter are you in? 11:4. Mine says in verse 4, Moses says, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight, I am going into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who's behind the millstones, all the firstborn of the cattle as well." Verse 6, "Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and there shall never be again." So my translation reads just firstborn. And before I just draw any conclusions here, does anybody with a New King James, Old King James, New English Standard read any differently than just firstborn? Does anybody else have a translation that may say firstborn son? Does anybody else have that one by any chance? Or was that just the NIV that's doing that? So everybody else has just firstborn? Am I right about that? So I don't know about that, Debbie. Let me look into that, because it appears maybe the NIV has drawn a conclusion that the other translations didn't, you know what I'm saying, didn't draw that. Maybe it's more accurate just to say firstborn. I've always thought it was just firstborn. Right, that's the way I've always read it. I never knew there was a translation that said firstborn. So I've heard that, but when you read the English Standard, New King James, it just says firstborn. So that's where I lean towards. So good observation, though. So anybody else, before we get to our questions on page 16, these are very important. And again, let me just say this. You know, so often we look at these plagues and we say we reserve these for our kids. The kids sing the songs about the 12 plagues. This is for their classes. Brothers and sisters, this is not for just kids. This is for all of us, because we're reading about the power of God. We're reading about God's ability to do anything he wants to do, and God exposing error, religious error, and the false gods of the Egyptians. Yes, sir, Brother Tim. Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's exactly right. Yes. Great observation. Yes. Excellent observation, Tim. And I think that also contributed to a man like Pharaoh having the kind of pride that he had, because he was viewed as a god, as a deity. Absolutely. Brother Scott, yes, sir. Brother Jeff, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. Who are you talking about? The magicians? Yeah, they're just trying to just please Pharaoh. I don't know what to say about that. Yeah, exactly, and yeah, but they couldn't, and they weren't about anything, and it didn't take very long before they were exposed. So, Brother Matt, yes, sir. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's exactly right. They were worried about their own credibility. Good point. Good point. Brother Don, yes, sir. Hmm. Hmm. Sure, sure. That makes sense. Again, to me, just if you ask my personal thinking on it, I've always just taken it to be the firstborn. I used to believe it was firstborn son, but that was just going by what I had heard until I looked at it myself. I never looked at the NIV on it. I'm sorry, Debbie, but all the other translations, what I saw, just said firstborn. Regardless, whether it's your son or your daughter, I got two children. I have a son and a daughter. And I don't want to lose any of them. I don't want to lose any of my children, whether it's a boy or a girl. So as a parent, and I know I can speak for the parents in the room, do you want to lose any of your children? You want to lose your daughters, your sons, firstborn, even the lastborn? I don't want to lose any of them. I can imagine waking up in the middle of the night, keep in mind, going in my kid's room, and my firstborn is dead. Can you imagine how devastating that was? But I will say this. If I'm going to blame somebody, you know who I'm going to blame? I'm blaming Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh is the reason all this happened, his stubbornness. And I think you see that if y'all read the text carefully. The Egyptians, as time goes by, some of them start getting frustrated with him because he's bringing all these problems on them because of his stubbornness. So I'm blaming Pharaoh for this if I'm going to blame somebody. Brother Billy, yes, sir. What do you say, sir? That's, huh? Well, that's your firstborn still, right? Yeah. So that's the way I take it. Yeah. Still, it's devastating. Anybody else? Any other observations? Let's get now to the questions. Let's start with, we're going to put 8, 9, and 10 together on page 16. The questions are this. What stands out to you about how Pharaoh responded to each plague? Who was God exposing with each plague? When did the plagues begin to exclude the children of Israel? What can we learn from that? So let's have a discussion. Let's talk about these things. First question. What stands out to you about how Pharaoh responds to each plague? Anybody? Arrogance. And explain, elaborate some more if you don't mind, Brother Dunn. So you say he was a selfish man. He didn't care about other people suffering. He just cared about himself. Okay, good. Anybody else? What stands out to you about how Pharaoh responds after each plague? Anybody? From your Bible study on this. Yes. Yeah. 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 Yeah, to me, no, that's exactly right. I think he's a proud man, and I think he cares about how people think about him. I think you see that when you look at the text. He's worried about, not being looked upon as this powerful man and this great man. And he doesn't want anything to diminish that influence. I think he really cares about that. Brother Joe, yes, sir. Right. Absolutely. Isn't that hard for me and sometimes let go of power and authority? We see it to this day. Absolutely. That's absolutely right. Anybody else? Anybody else? These are good thoughts here that stands out to you about Pharaoh and how he's reacting. Because after each plague takes place, what does he do? What does he do after each plague? Hardens his heart. And I want to just say this. First off, I promise Matt, I'm not going to preach a sermon for him. He'll do a great job. He's studied hard on this. Matt's going to preach a lesson about this on Sunday, for those of you who don't know, on Sunday night, Lord willing. And Matt's going to deal with this language because we did a study on this last Thursday, and we were amazed. I mean, we were just blown away when we noticed just how much that language is found in Exodus. And I know Matt will say this again later, but it's 20 times there, at least 20 times. But this is what I want to say about it, and I asked Matt if I could do this earlier. Look at Exodus chapter 4 in verse 21, and then I won't go too far on this. But I do want to point this out. In Exodus 4:21, this is when God has called Moses to go and do this mission to deliver his people. And it says, the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Now look at chapter 7 in verse 3. In chapter 7 in verse 3, God says, but I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. Okay, so there really in this instance here, you have two different kinds of language, variations of two different kinds of main language being used. Pharaoh hardens his heart. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. What I just want you to see is the Lord knew all of this was going to happen before it happens. Do you see that? God already knew how Pharaoh was going to act. God already knew what he was going to do to Pharaoh. He already knew this stuff ahead of time. So Pharaoh's not catching anybody off guard. He's not catching Moses off guard. God is in full control of everything. Not saying he's in full control of Pharaoh's actions, but he knows everything that's going to take place. Nothing's being done that's going to catch God off guard. It's interesting. Now, the easier language to see here is obviously the language Pharaoh hardened his heart. What does that mean, Pharaoh hardened his heart? Define that for me. Yeah, Shawn hardens his heart. How can I do that? Well, I can do that by sitting down with Matt, and Matt shows me Mark 16:16. Matt shows me Acts 2:38, and it says you got to be baptized to be right with God. You got to be baptized for forgiveness of sins. You got to be baptized to be saved. And I look at that and I say, well, I know it says that, but I don't like it. I'm not going to do it. That's hardening the heart, right? Haven't you seen that happen with people before? It happens with baptism, or maybe it's marriage, divorce, remarriage, whatever the case may be. That happens all the time. The other question that comes up is, what is that language about the Lord hardening his heart? Because I want to suggest that that's a little bit different, or in a lot of ways different than the previous language. And what's that about? Well, again, Matt's going to deal with that Sunday, but I will let you know it's a very interesting study, and it's powerful, and it is something that can be done today, and it happens all the time. So if you want to know more about that, 5 o'clock on Sunday, be here, because Matt is he's going to deal with that. So Moses, or not Moses, but Pharaoh's he's a hard-hearted man, and he's a man who begins in the beginning stages. It appears that God is, because if you really know this language, happen. You can goes in the Psalms, I believe, thoughts about that thing at all. That's the last one. If they wanted to make sure their firstborns didn't die also, they had to do something. No, that's an excellent observation. Right. I mean, you have God's grace all throughout this on them, but on that last one, they got to do something. And if they didn't do it, they would have lost their children also. Absolutely. Brother Spud, yes, sir. Right, absolutely. And that's what's going on. And that's a great point, because it shows me how God is determined to fulfill his promises to Abraham. God is determined to bring Jesus into the world through these people. And that's what's going on at the foundation of all of this. Is God protecting these people, preserving these people, and ultimately going to deliver these people, because he's thinking about us, ultimately, and our salvation. It's a great point, Brother Spud. Good point. Anybody else? Anybody else? Okay, so let's go to the next one. The next 4 questions, and then we're going to be done. 11 through 14, I'll read them together. List some examples of when the foreknowledge of God, and I hope you're not missing that, because it's all through this. God is clearly keep rejecting Pharaoh's compromise proposal. Why do you think Pharaoh was so stubborn and unrepentant, and can we develop hearts like Pharaoh today? So how? So the first one, when you read through these chapters in your Bible reading, or even just recently, when did you see the foreknowledge of God clearly on display? When we say foreknowledge of God, we're talking about God's ability to see into the future and know exactly what's going to happen. What are some examples of that? Brother Wayne. Mm-hmm. Yes, Brother Wayne's breaking Exodus 10:2. God thought about all this beforehand, and he's even thinking about future generations and how this is going to impact future generations of the Israelites, of the Hebrews. Absolutely. Great observation. That's Exodus 10, verse 2. Good one, Wayne. Anybody else where you see the foreknowledge of God in this text? Yeah. Yes. Right. 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 Yes. Yes, he did. Yes. It would have. It would have. I agree with that. I think Pharaoh did have an opportunity, but he never took advantage of it. And the thing about that, if you don't mind me adding to what you're saying, because that's a great point, God knew he was going to reject it. You know, that's deep if you think about it. Pharaoh did have a choice, but God knew the whole time he wasn't going to make the right choice. But God was still going to be glorified either way. So that's a good point. Brother Matt, yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Because starting in verse 15, what God says is, "For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence,
Mm-hmm.
and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power,
Right.
so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." God is pointing out that really this whole thing, if the purpose is only to deliver Israel, it's unnecessary.
Right. All this is unnecessary. Done that a long time ago. Right. Right.
But that's not God's purpose.
Right.
God's purpose is to humiliate Pharaoh.
Yes.
Take the greatest king and the greatest nation on earth and make him do something that he would almost rather die.
Yes.
That they are going to go out because they were elected to go because God made Pharaoh.
That's an excellent point. In fact, if y'all don't mind me going ahead and leading to the next one, and that kind of ties to question 12, Matt. before I get there, because I want to elaborate on what you just said, let me just tell you a couple other examples I had here of where you see God's foreknowledge. Everything y'all say is right on the money. I also put down how God he knew ahead of time how Pharaoh was going to react to all of this. I also put on here how God knew that once the death of the firstborn took place, they were going to be let go. Did y'all catch that? God said, once this one happens, He's going to let you go. Up to then, God always said He's going to harden His heart. He's going to harden His heart. But then after that, before that one, God said He's going to let you go after this one. The foreknowledge of God there. Brother Carl, yes, sir. Chapter 3, verse 12. And he says, certainly I'll be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God this mountain. They're coming back to Mount Sinai. Good one. Yep, that's before anything started, absolutely. And then one more I had was when they got to the Red Sea. Remember, they got there, and God told Moses, Pharaoh's going to come after you again. He's going to think you lost. But that's what God wanted. God knew all this was going to happen. And God wanted Pharaoh to come out there. He wants Pharaoh to peek his head out of the hole because he's going to cut it off. I mean, that's what God is doing. God is baiting him. He wanted the Israelites to look like they were lost because he wanted Pharaoh to think that, so Pharaoh will come out, and eventually Pharaoh and his army will be lost in the Red Sea. So God ultimately is not only going to humiliate this man, but he ultimately will destroy this man. And it's showing the power of God. And either you get on God, either you do it God's way or you suffer. And that brings you to question 12. Why did Moses keep rejecting Pharaoh's compromise proposal? If you read this text, particularly Exodus chapter 10, in Exodus 10, verses 8 down to verse 11, and in verses 21 down to verse 29, there are a couple of times when Pharaoh says, like, he's hearing his people around him. In fact, in verse 7 of Exodus 10, look at what it says. Verse 7, Pharaoh's servants, said to him, how long will this man be a snare to us? It says Pharaoh's stubbornness has been a problem for us. How much longer we got to put up with this man's stubbornness? Let the men go that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not realize that Egypt is being destroyed? Wake up, Pharaoh. Look at what we're going through. So, from 8 down to verse 11, Pharaoh is going to say, okay, go ahead and go. Go ahead and go. Who all going, though? Moses says, everybody. Grown-ups, the kids. And Pharaoh's like, no, I'm not going to have that. Y'all are not, no, that's how many people are going. Y'all are not going. He changed his mind. Then when you go down to verse 21, down to verse 28, Pharaoh again, he's feeling the pressure of his kingdom. He's mean, he's looking bad, and he says, okay, y'all can go, but don't let the animals go. Don't let the livestock go. You can take the kids, all the adults can go, don't take the animals. And Moses says, no, we need the animals to make a sacrifice to God. And then Pharaoh says, oh, you're not going at all. And if I see you again, you're going to be dead. So he hardens his heart again. So why does Moses keep rejecting those compromises? It seems like Pharaoh's like, hey, you can go, but don't let the animals go. Why does he keep rejecting that? Yes. That's the point. Joe, you nailed it. That's the point. Why does Moses have to compromise? Because God doesn't have to compromise. What is God's ultimate plan here? What's his ultimate plan for Israel? To just go 3 days into the wilderness? Is that what God ultimately wants? He wants them to go for good. And when he wants them to go, who all does he want to go? Everybody and their animals. In fact, God even said not only are you going to take all your animals out and all your kids out, but you're going to get spoils of war without even fighting. So why does God have to compromise with this man when it's going to be his way all the way regardless? See, Pharaoh trying to save face, going with that language Tim said. He's trying to, I got some authority here. God's kind of compromising with me. God, I don't have to compromise with you. We're not going to take that compromise because in the end, everything that I say I want is going to be done. And you're going to let it be done. You're going to have to accept it. So God is going to, his whole purpose is to humble Pharaoh. And that's what he's going to do. So let's stop right there. We'll finish up on question 13 next time. And then we'll get right to lesson 5, okay? Thank y'all very much.